Emotions. This is the most misunderstood category within the realm of intelligence itself. Almost everyone who talks about intelligence or tries to be someone who's intelligent always messes up with the emotion part because they try to act like some serious, nonchalant genius, aka you know who, and they end up suppressing so much to the point where it blows up in their face. I'll be covering the 4 subcategories of emotional intelligence, which are perception, understanding, facilitation, and management. Make sure to take notes because you won't retain it all in one sitting, so we've added timestamps for you to jump back into each section. Start with understanding what emotional intelligence is, what components it consists of, and how to develop each component. I'll give you the textbook line once, and then we'll actually use it. So, emotional intelligence, or EI, is the ability to acquire, process, and utilize emotional information. Note that the term information is included in the definition. Emotions are often opposed to rational thinking, as if a person thinks only one way exclusively, either rationally or emotionally. However, emotions can carry information. For example, fear can signal danger, and anger can indicate the presence of an obstacle or injustice, and sadness can indicate the loss of something or someone important. Of course, the information embedded in emotions is not always accurate. The danger might not be there, the obstacle can easily be bypassed, and the loss may be insignificant. However, the fact that emotions carry information is undeniable. The problem is that people often do not understand what information their emotions carry, where their emotions come from, and whether this information is even correct. So, this is where the emotional intelligence comes in. Thus, the key difference between emotionally intelligent people and everyone else is not in their emotions, but in their ability to process this information correctly. A person may feel the strongest emotions, but still possess a high level of emotional intelligence. The difference lies in their ability to comprehend what these emotions mean and act accordingly. The concept of emotional intelligence is quite modern, actually. It was introduced in the 1990s by psychologists Peter Salovey and John Mewmore. They define it as an ability to perceive, understand, and regulate emotions. Daniel Goleman expanded on this notion, promoting the idea extensively in the media. Nevertheless, there is more than one model of EQ, and the fact that there are several theories is crucial because people often confuse EQ with a simple set of traits, while in reality, it is a complex notion best defined as a set of abilities. For the purpose of this video, the ability model is the best option because it views emotional intelligence as a skill, not a trait. The first layer of emotional intelligence is emotional perception, and it deals with our ability to perceive that some emotional state has occurred, or is currently occurring, more specifically that an emotion with a certain content is occurring. While that may sound extremely vague and detached from reality, almost everyone knows what emotions feel like. Things like anger, anxiety, excitement, and sadness. The challenge is not necessarily perceiving the emotion after it has manifested, but rather in noticing it early enough for it to have any practical value. You don't always consciously think, I feel anxious, but you may notice that you're getting impatient with other people, that you are about to say something that you subsequently regret, or that your tolerance for certain topics has significantly decreased. The feeling is already affecting you, but you haven't recognized it for what it is yet. Furthermore, you may not even be correctly identifying the emotion in the first place. So, what we're going to cover in this section is how to perceive those emotions properly and accurately. And we're going to do this by separating it into 2 key elements. The first is interoception, which is identifying the physical sensations that accompany the emotion. And the second is emotional granularity, which is being able to distinguish different emotions from each other. We went into this a bit in the last video, but we didn't cover it extensively. So that's what we're going to do now. So for interoception, which is the first key element, is the perception of our physical sensations and its role in our emotional awareness. Your heart starts beating faster, you may start sweating, and your muscles tense. All the types of changes that are characteristic of emotions. In addition, they sometimes occur before your emotions are even conscious within your own mind. So your body reacts and your brain hasn't even caught up to what's occurring. This, in essence, is the Hermetic principle of correspondence. So the body, which is mirroring the external, is being mirrored by the internal. So your emotional and physical plane are being mirrored by each other, essentially. That is why it can be useful to observe our bodies sometimes, to be attuned with those physical sensations as early warning signs. Not all of them will be indicative of something specific, but they may give you valuable context for examining your mental state. The point is not to immediately assign words to your emotions, but rather to start being aware of the changes that happen within your body as an indication of your mental state. Neuroscientist Antonio Damasio's somatic marker hypothesis also backs this up. His research found that bodily signals often guide our responses before we're even consciously aware of them. The second key element that comprises our ability to recognize emotions is emotional granularity, or our ability to distinguish between different emotions. So let's say you're angry, for example. That's simple and straightforward. And a lot of people use it. They just say, I'm angry. But it's rarely the whole truth. Anger, for instance, can be mixed with irritation, resentment, humiliation, etc. So we have all these different layers, and a single emotion can have multiple layers, or more commonly, be mistaken for another emotion fairly often. For example, you can be embarrassed but mistake the feeling for aggression and try to express it outwardly through insults, even though you're more likely to want to retreat from the interaction instead. So each case deals with a slightly different matter, and each requires a different approach. One cannot simply dismiss all emotions and interactions just because some of them might be unpleasant or undesired. It grants you a certain amount of detachment, the ability to understand the matter without getting immediately caught up and swept away by it. That can be especially useful whenever the emotion has a fairly straightforward solution. You're not recognizing it for whatever reason. When you're embarrassed, you can do something about it. You can change the subject, walk away, apologize, or even acknowledge it and move on. However, that is only true if you're aware of the feeling and what it really is. A good idea to practice emotional granularity is to think carefully about what you feel, specifically to analyze your emotions and differentiate between them, rather than accepting the broadest possible definition. If you think that you feel angry, you can ask yourself what kind of anger it is, or if it is, in fact, anger at all. You can think about what has happened before the emotion has manifested to determine what have caused it. And I'm going to refer to this a lot in the video, but journaling here is very important because when you're able to journal, you're getting outside of your interior mind and you're putting it onto an exterior surface. So you're making it manifest into something that is concrete. And then once it's concrete, you can actually analyze it. So for emotional granularity, I'd say study vocab, which allows you to define your emotions better, and then be able to externalize those emotions so you can analyze them. And then, analyze if they're accurate to what you're feeling. And the more that you're able to get it out there, the better you're able to perceive it. The next layer is emotional understanding, which is a bit like perception, but now you're building the connection between events and emotions, and understanding the thought processes that turn one into the other. You can recognize the emotion, that's great, but you need to understand the thought process behind it as well. You need to understand what has happened, how it connects to the emotion, and what you intend to do as a consequence. A good way to conceptualize it is to build a model of how your emotions work, a scenario where a certain event has occurred, and what you thought about it, and what you wanted to do. For example, you're sending a message to someone and they're not replying. Depending on what you think about that fact, you can feel different emotions ranging from irritation to embarrassment, and each of those emotions can affect your behavior afterwards. Depending on why you think it has happened, it can affect you more or less. If you think that they are simply busy, you're more likely to feel irritated, while if you believe that they are trying to be rude, you're likely to feel angry, and so on forth. If you're aware of that, you can recognize what you think and feel. The more you know about the causes and consequences of your emotions, the more control you have over them. You cannot simply disregard the fact that you feel a certain way, but you can change the way that you act based on what you know about the cause of your emotions. If you recognize that you feel embarrassed, for instance, you are aware of the way that your emotion is likely to affect you, so you can decide not to engage in the behavior that would lead to greater embarrassment afterwards. In essence, emotional understanding allows you to build your emotional awareness so that you can gain true emotional control, rather than simply being aware of them. So I'm going to give you an example of how, we can conceptualize this a little bit better, so it makes a little bit more sense symbolically. So imagine you have like an aura, right? And that aura is basically your emotions. So emotional perception is being able to be aware of that aura. And then emotional understanding is being able to control that. So when you understand your emotions, you're able to control the shape and the flow of that aura itself. And that's what we're going to practice now more with emotional chains. One important aspect of emotional understanding is that it allows you to recognize emotional chains, a series of events where one emotion leads to another, which in turn leads to another set of consequences. Emotions can occur independently, but they can also intertwine with one another to produce more complex results. Once you recognize the chain, however, you can cut it off, or at the very least, be aware of how your thoughts turn emotions into actions and the consequences of those actions. A good way to examine some of the complex emotional interactions is simply to go through the details of how you feel after certain events. The more complex emotions are, the better you can recognize emotional chains and their emotional consequences. If you feel a certain way after encountering a particular issue, you can always ask yourself what happened, what you thought, what you felt, and what you wanted to do. After you have done all those things, you can examine the consequence of your actions and your feelings. You can do this in any situation to determine what has actually happened and the full extent of your emotional response. The more that you do that, the better you can recognize these patterns, or situations where you tend to feel certain emotions, the reasons behind those emotions, and the effects that they tend to have on your behavior. And once you realize that, you can intervene. Rather than dismissing the emotion, you can examine it and determine how it's going to affect you, so that you can change your behavior while you still have the chance. The third layer of emotional intelligence is emotional facilitation. It examines the ways in which our emotions interact with our thoughts and how you're able to exit and enter those emotional states. Those emotional states facilitate different types of thinking, and the ability to enter those states affect the different abilities to think. An obvious example is anxiety, which can facilitate certain types of thought processes while inhibiting others. A certain degree of anxiety is necessary almost everywhere. It sharpens your senses and makes you more aware, so you're more likely to pay attention to detail and perform better overall. This is supported by the Yerkes-Dodson law, which found that performance rises with arousal, only up to a certain point. Once you get past that point, or that peak, more pressure starts working against you rather than for you. A good example of this is Kurapika and his ability Emperor Time. It only activates when he focuses his anger toward the Phantom Troop. Without the emotional state, the ability isn't available to him. In this sense, his anger isn't separate from his thinking. It becomes the very thing that develops his perception and unlocks a new level of precision that he can't reach when he's calm. But the moment that his anger gets past a certain level, or certain threshold, the effect reverses and his control slips. And some of his own techniques even turn against him if carelessly used in that state. This mirrors the Yerkes-Dodson law almost perfectly. A certain degree of emotional arousal facilitates his thinking and performance, but once it exceeds the limit, the same emotion begins working against him instead. Emotional intelligence, in turn, is all about being aware of the ways that different emotions affect our thoughts, which also is crucial for understanding how to effectively deal with those emotions. The most important realization is that emotions are another type of thinking. So whenever they influence our cognitive processes, they do so in a similar way to thoughts themselves. You cannot simply think your way out of emotions either, but you can recognize how they influence your thoughts and decide whether that influence is useful or not. A useful application of this is emotional facilitation, which involves recognizing the ways that emotions help us think and using that information for our advantage. Once you become sufficiently familiar with the concepts, you can use them to examine yourself and determine what you're really feeling in any given moment. You can identify emotions for which you know the effect of your thoughts and use that information to help you get through the situation. For instance, when you are in an important conversation and your heart is pounding, you can tell yourself that your body is preparing you for a challenge and that you should continue doing what you're doing rather than running away from the situation or distracting yourself instead. And now finally, emotional management. Emotional management is the discipline of choosing how you behave in response to what you feel, so the emotion works for you instead of against you. Most people suppress their emotions and mistake it for emotional management, but it's really about choosing how to behave in accordance with your emotional state so that you can minimize the negative effects and maximize the positive ones. Whenever you feel something unpleasant, there's a natural reaction that most people would have, but it's not always rational or beneficial. Psychologist James Gross' process model, which we referred to earlier, of emotion regulation supports this, as it distinguishes strategies that intervene before an emotion fully forms from those that only kick in after it's already there. Once the emotion has arisen, you're working with the response and not the emotion itself. And this is going to make the video really long, but I'm going to be giving you guys a variety of methods for increasing emotional management, as it's way more complex and varied than I believe any of the other subcategories. So, to start, I believe that the best way of managing negative emotions is to inhibit your response for as long as it takes for you to understand what they're really about. That is what response inhibition is all about. When you feel yourself about to do or say something, you put it on hold for a moment to consider your options. So let's say you get angry at somebody and you want to immediately tell them off, but instead you restrain yourself and rethink the situation, which hilariously is basically what a therapist charges you to do or teaches you to do on purpose. Sometimes you only need a second, which is enough for you to realize that you don't really want to do what you're about to do, or at least understand why you want to do it. The response isn't appropriate either. It only becomes one because of the timing. You are emotionally triggered and you don't have the mental capacity to make a good choice by then. By delaying it, you give yourself the option to make a better choice. Neuroscientist Joseph Ledoux's research found that the brain has two pathways for processing emotion: a fast, low road that triggers an automatic reaction before you're even conscious of it, and then a slower, high road through the prefrontal cortex that allows for more deliberate responses. Another useful tool for emotional management is reappraisal, or reinterpreting your emotions. We talked about this last video as well. It is fairly common for people to get very angry when they're criticized, but you can also feel amused or embarrassed, depending on what has actually happened and what you really feel. Reappraisal is only useful if it is practiced as a method, not simply understood as a concept. So to do it, you need to utilize emotional perception. Then, before any behavioral response, 3 questions should be asked in this order. First, what occurred? Describe without interpretation. And then second, what interpretation has been assigned to the event by default. And then third, whether an alternative interpretation is equally consistent with the same facts. This procedure is supported by Aaron Beck's model of cognitive restructuring, as identifying negative interpretations are the primary driver of emotional distress. So when we generate different interpretations, we can mitigate the negative effects. Separately, research by Ethan Cross on self-distancing found that individuals who analyze a distressing event from third-person or observer perspectives, rather than a first-person one, showed lower emotional reactivity and reduced physiological stress responses compared to those who reflect on the same event in first person. It's important to understand, however, that you cannot simply ignore the facts and convince yourself that everything is fine. Sometimes you are right to feel the way that you do. Other times, it helps to recognize that you're exaggerating or placing too much emphasis on the matter. Either way, you can use emotional reappraisal to change the way that you feel, so that you can get more benefit from it. Next up, we have distress tolerance, and the main difference between emotional management and distress tolerance is that the latter focuses specifically on staying within the situation rather than changing your response to it. It examines your ability to be in the middle of an emotionally distressing situation and not try to escape it immediately in an attempt to make it go away. To improve distress tolerance, treat the discomfort as something that will go away as a wave, rather than something that needs to be dealt with. And this can honestly go for any emotion. All emotions come and go with peaks and recede over periods, usually within minutes. Even heartbreak, or like the worst emotions you can feel, tend to go away within a month or two. Sometimes they don't due to complexes that we have, but generally they come and they go. This is formalized in dialectical behavior therapy. Lanhan's approach treats the ability to remain in a distressing state without acting to end it immediately as trainable, not fixed. And the principle is actually very simple. When you're in a situation that you perceive to be emotionally damaging, the longer you stay there, the more that you realize that it's not that bad. As a result, you build emotional tolerance to similar situations, which makes you less likely to feel threatened by them in the future. So far, we've only talked about how to manage your own emotions, but emotional intelligence also encompasses other people's emotions. You can learn to recognize them in the same way that you recognize your own emotions. And you can read others' emotions based on their body language and their facial expressions and other cues. However, you also need to learn to identify those emotions so that you can understand those people, how they feel, how they think, and what they are likely to do as a result of those emotions. Empathy is primarily about understanding others' emotions, And it's a fairly broad term, but it encompasses multiple levels of understanding. Emotional contagion, in other words, is the ability to feel what other people feel, to think the same thoughts, feel the same emotions, and believe the same things that they believe. Elaine Hatfield's original research on emotional contagion found that people unconsciously mimic others' facial expressions, vocal tone, and posture, and that mimicry itself produces the corresponding emotion within the observer. In other words, you do not choose to catch someone else's feelings or their mood. Your body enacts it first, and then the feeling follows afterwards. A manhwa that I actually love helps explain this while being entertaining. It's called Dr. Frost, and Dr. Frost reads people's emotional states and uses reasoning to derive conclusions from those patients, his opponents, and pretty much everyone. Just read chapter 1 and you'll basically get a good gist of what the entire thing is about. Another great exercise for developing empathy is perspective taking. One of the easiest questions to ask when someone does something irritating or confusing is, why would anyone do that? Or why would anyone want to do that? A better question to that is, what would have to be true about their world for that behavior to be rational for them? Because we know that people operate within the realm of what is rational in their own minds. Maybe they're feeling insecure, perhaps something that happened and that happening wasn't known to you. A good habit to improve this physically is moving your position, like standing where the person stood from, or sitting where they sat, or even facing their direction. This helps put yourself in their mindscape, and embodied cognition research actually suggests that adopting someone else's physical vantage point, even briefly, makes it easier to access their perspective than reasoning about it in the abstract from your own position. I know, it sounds stupid, but the shift in your literal viewpoint affects your mental viewpoint, which interestingly enough, we can point back to the law of correspondence. The value of perspective taking is that it reduces the degree to which the other person's behavior is filtered through our own feelings and assumptions. Now, before concluding this video, there's one final point that needs to be made about emotional intelligence, and it's quite important. Being emotionally intelligent does not mean never being angry or always agreeing with someone or never confronting someone. Any emotionally intelligent person can say no. They can have all the same thoughts that anyone else has. The difference is that they do not automatically act on them. Someone may very well understand why someone is upset and not accept their interpretations or actions. So, how does one go about training emotional intelligence in general? Well, there isn't really one exercise that suddenly makes you emotionally intelligent. The skill comes from seeing things in the same pattern over and over again, observing the same chain of events, and learning ways to interrupt them. One of the easier ways to begin is with an emotional journal. You don't need to write, "Today I was angry," you just need to reconstruct the entire situation you were in and explain to yourself the following things. Number 1, what happened? Number 2, what do you think it means? And number 3, what did you feel? Now, ask yourself the following question. Knowing what you know now, would you interpret the same situation differently? That is a much more useful exercise than simply writing about emotions. Just being a little bit more social unconsciously primes your emotional intelligence, and you'll adapt to what people naturally feel and how they act. And your mind will merge and acclimate to the collective unconscious, which genuinely is probably the best way to train. You could ignore every other point I made in this video, because in essence, emotions are the language which we as humans talk through fundamentally. And if I just told you, okay, to improve your emotional intelligence, just go talk to other people for a long time and talk to different people, it could seriously help you. So at some point, the following interesting observation can be made about that. You stop noticing the patterns after they happen, and you start to notice when they're happening and in the moment. You're able to interrupt those daily conversations and say, wait, I'm jumping to a conclusion here. Obviously, you're not going to say that, but your mind's going to bring that up. And you're going to start to have these things that just pop up in your mind. It's like, oh, wait, just, double check yourself here. And you can spot yourself becoming more impulsive or avoidant or even passive aggressive because your brain has trained itself to notice those patterns. So in essence, it's just the patterns and recognition of those patterns and being aware of it. And that, in the end, is emotional intelligence. The next time you feel something strongly, instead of asking yourself what you can do to make it go away, ask, what is it trying to tell you? And I'll leave you guys with that. Thank you guys for watching, and if you think this guide was helpful, make sure to subscribe and tell me what you guys thought in the comments below.